Alright, we are back with a new video, and we are back updating the Survivor 43 power rankings following episode 2, and this was an interesting episode. I feel like there was some pretty fun stuff happening in Leah to that tribal, even if the boot itself was pretty obvious, but I also felt like there was some strange stuff going on in the edit, like Coco barely getting any screen time, and certain characters being presented in different ways than I was expecting coming in, but I'm going to do my best to break down the rankings here. But there are 17 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 17, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Justine. And as I said in the preseason, I wasn't entirely sure what to make of Justine, as I felt like she could have gone either way, but obviously now knowing what we saw in the season, it's pretty obvious that she didn't really have a deep run in her. Now, obviously, she did a bit more wrong to be voted out than Mariah here, in that she actively told Jesse to his face that she didn't know if she could trust him, which obviously was a pretty bad sign there. But I feel like even outside that, I feel like her and Noel were just naturally on the out, given their inability to build strong relationships with the other side, to where they were being targeted early on. They were identified as this duo. And obviously the fact that Justine was taken out over Noel here is probably more a sign of challenge strength than anything else. I kind of assume that they see Noel as a bigger challenge asset moving forward than Justine is. And I felt like her edit didn't really justify that much of a deep run anyway. And now obviously she does talk a bit in her exit interview about how things were taken out of context and how there could have been some gender bias involved with her being targeted over making a fire while Gabler gets a free pass for being a man that started the fire, which I don't know. I felt that a bit far-fetched, but I felt like there were just bigger reasons why she was targeted over that. So at the end of the day, I feel like Justine probably played a bit more actively than Mariah, and she at least built the bond early on with Noel, but obviously she made more mistakes to be voted out, so because of that, she is here at number 17. And with that, there are 16 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game, based on their edit and their current game position. But number 16, the person I believe is the least likely to win the game from this point, is Neca. And I feel like Neca has gone a largely under the radar edit here, but not in a way that really sets her up for a future storyline here. And I feel like the biggest knock to her edit in this episode is that despite her being the target coming into the tribal here, she really doesn't get any content in terms of her saving herself. It feels like all the focus is on Cody and Jesse. Like they're doing the work to make sure that they have the numbers. And then obviously later on, Cody with his beware advantage. And I feel like even Dwight gets more strategic content here with him deliberating over like trying to keep Justine and Noel, who he feels a bit closer with, versus working with Cody, who he established not building that great of a bond with. So the fact that Neca doesn't get too much content here in terms of her saving herself is a pretty big red flag in my personal opinion. And when you top that off with her pretty lackluster premiere and the fact that she doesn't seem to be that big of a character, I feel like she doesn't really have a shot of winning the game at this point. And I know some people may disagree with that, but I feel like, again, after 2 episodes, she should have had a considerably bigger presence than this, and especially in an episode where her tribe goes to tribal when she is one of the options to go home. So I feel like because of that, I can't have her too much higher than here. So because of that, she is here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have a really weird case to talk about here. But here we have Gabler. And I did drop Gabler quite a bit on this ranking here, as I felt like this was a mostly bad episode for him, where obviously a lot of it focuses on him not having too much strength and how every passing moment he is becoming more of a liability for his tribe and how this adventure is pushing him to his limits, which is a really bad sign for me, especially considering in the premiere he was all about how he wants to take risks and play the game. Whereas now it does seem like he's a bit out of his element here, which is probably not the best sign for him moving forward, especially considering the content he got in episode 1, where I felt like if he had gotten this in episode 1, maybe he could have gotten a turnaround, like started to grow, and yeah, at that point he probably wouldn't have won anyway. It probably would have been more in line with a journey edit, but at least then it would have been a storyline here. But it does seem like he's going a bit downhill here, and yes, while he does have an idol that he can use at the next tribal, I don't feel that confident about his longevity in the game, with really his only out here being this men's alliance holding together, which obviously I'll talk about later with Owen and Sammy, but like if that doesn't go through, I feel like Gabler would be a pretty clear target at one of these next few tribals here. But even outside that, I felt like his content was just all over the place, and I can't really justify putting him too much higher here than number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have someone who I was already very low on, and granted at this point I don't feel like they have any shot, but I did feel like this was a slight improvement for them. But here we have Dwight. And again, I feel like Dwight had such a bad premiere that I don't feel like he is very likely to win at this point. And this episode was okay, I guess. But even then, it's not that great. Where on one hand, he does get his intro package, he does get to talk about being a journalist and how he isn't afraid to approach big people like politicians and stuff like that. And we do understand his position a bit better in the game, which honestly isn't that great. I mean, it is established that he was kind of on his own during the early stretches here, where he does have a bond to a degree with Justine and Noel, but obviously this episode focused more on him trying to connect more with Jesse here. But even so, like he is trying to push Jesse to keep Noel and Justine intact, which I do feel like is a bit of a knock here in that, yes, he does have a bond with them, but it's also very early in the game. It is the first tribal. Plus, he doesn't even have a vote, so I feel like that alone takes away a lot of leverage that he could have had to influence the situation here. And obviously, by the end, he does end up losing Justine, someone he did have one of the better relationships with, all over Cody, who is someone who he hasn't really connected super well with. So at this point, I feel pretty conflicted about Dwight, as he did get a better episode here. He did get more content, more personal content, and we do have a better sense of where he stands in the game. But obviously, he doesn't get his way at the end of the day. And with Cody still in the game, I feel like he isn't set up super well moving forward. But I do feel like with him improving his relationship with Jesse, he could get into a majority, I guess. But I feel like at this point, he's been undercut enough in the edit to where I don't see him winning. So because of that, he is here number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have another person from the Vessi tribe, but here we have Noel here. And obviously this wasn't that great of an episode for Noel, where she obviously doesn't get her way here. She does lose Justine, who was one of her closer allies. And even outside of that, I mean, yes, she does get some personal content talking about her leg, but she already got personal content about her leg. And even outside of that, I feel like she's not being set up for a season-long story here, to where I feel like she isn't really primed to win the game here. Now, granted, I don't feel like she's guaranteed to be in the next boot per se. I feel like she could reintegrate to a degree, but it's still not looking great for her coming into this next tribal. So because of that, she is here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and these next few players are pretty weird to talk about here, as they're both on the same tribe, and they were actually the only two players on their tribe to even get content in this episode. But number 12, we do have Ryan here. And the reason I had Ryan lower here is I do feel like he could be set up to be picked off at this next tribal here, where it's obviously not a guarantee per se, but it is still a possibility, particularly if Carla wants to work more with Gio moving forward and sees him as more her in per se. But obviously Carla does talk about wanting to break up Ryan and Gio here, saying how close they are. And with Ryan getting less personal content here, I do worry about him to a degree. Now, granted, it's not a guarantee, as again, we could see Gio being taken out here as well, as Gio did get his personal content here, while Ryan was set up a bit more in the premiere. So I feel like that is the main argument for Ryan staying over Gio. But considering like the fact that neither of them are super well positioned here, I did decide to leave him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone I just mentioned, but here we have Gio here. And I do think that Gio has a bit more outs here in that there is the established relationship with Carla. I do feel like that is at least something that could cause Carla and the majority group to keep him over Ryan. However, there are still some knocks here. I mean, for one, he is physically weaker than Ryan. I feel like if Coco does go to tribal, that Gio will be considered as a potential target due to Ryan being needed for challenges more. But there's also the fact that he does get his personal content here. He talks about being a gay man and how he was rejected by his family. And while that could be seen as a positive to a degree, I don't really see it that way, as for one, he is getting it in episode 2 instead of the premiere, whereas Ryan at least got more personal content in the premiere. But also, the way that it's set up does feel a bit more like a journey edit to me, where Gio is probably being set up as someone who is out here for the experience of trying to get past some of this rejection, which again, very rarely leads to a win here. And the fact that it does come in episode 2 does worry me to a degree that maybe this could just be them wrapping up his story sooner rather than later, to where maybe Geo is the one taken out at this next tribal. So again, I don't really feel great about either Ryan or Geo here, as I feel like either of them could be taken out if Coco goes to tribal. But I feel like Geo is a bit more likely to stay over Ryan, as there is at least a potential for him working with Carla moving forward that could be seen as a meaningful relationship. But at the end of the day, I feel like neither of them have that great of a shot of winning. So because of that, I do have Geo here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we're moving over to the Baka tribe. And again, I haven't felt great about this person so far, and I still don't feel that good about them. But here we have Janine here. And again, I walk away from this episode not feeling too great about Janine. Now, she does have a somewhat consistent presence here, with her talking about her relationship with Ellie and how she checked Gabler's back after the challenge to see if he has an idol. She talks about how, oh, I don't like the lion she, but in the game, everything goes. And obviously, she learns about Gabler's idol and how it will still be active if they go back to tribal. So at least there's that. She does get some gameplay content there. But even then, I feel like a lot of her content is her following Ellie. I feel like she doesn't really have too much outside of that. And actually, even in the premiere, I feel like that was undercut by her not wanting Mariah to go, despite Ellie wanting to, and then Ellie getting her way there. And now, at this point, she just kind of stuck with Ellie. So I feel like even then, despite her getting all this content, I feel like it's not really setting herself up super well. And plus, her and Ellie are both underestimating the men by thinking that they're not working together, only to see them coming together to form an alliance, which does make me a bit worried about Janine. I feel like if they go back to tribal, I feel like she could very likely go home at this next tribal, so which is a big reason that I don't have her super high on this list. But with that said, she did get a consistent presence in this episode, which is enough to have her slightly higher than what she was last week. But at the end of the day, I still don't feel great about her. So because of that, she is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have another person who I still don't feel that great about. And considering how invisible they were in this episode, you would think they'd be lower, but I actually did bump them up a little bit. But here we have Cassidy. And it's really strange that she's this high on the list considering she didn't get any content. However, that is at least consistent with the storyline she was set up with in the premiere, where she talks about being a fox who is cunning and is someone who's going to lay back and just wait to strike, which is a bit more consistent with what she got here with her not getting any content here. So at least there's that. But at the end of the day, I still don't feel that great about her. I do worry that she could be a target if they do decide to keep Geo and maybe they try to flip the vote in the last minute. But with that said, I do feel a bit more confident that she'll at least survive that vote, as it does seem like there could be the potential of targeting both Ryan and Geo, but it's still not 100% guaranteed. So because of that, I do have to leave her here at number 9. Now I'm moving on to number 8, and we're going back to the Baka tribe, to another player that I don't feel that great about, but I do feel like they have at least some longevity at this point. But here we have Owen. And again, I was kind of expecting a more substantial follow-up to Owen after his somewhat lackluster premiere, but I feel like we didn't really get that. I mean, he does get that whole segment of him carrying the water pot back to camp and calling himself a lovable curmudgeon, but I don't really see that as a strong character moment for him. It just seemed a bit silly in my opinion. And then later on, we hear Ellie calling him her younger child, despite him being older than Sammy, and her saying that he requires more attention and he's more high maintenance, which is a pretty big knock to him. But it's not as big of a knock as it seems on the surface, as it does seem to tie more into Ellie underestimating the guys. And we do see back at camp that the guys do agree to come together. Now, granted, I don't feel like that scene of the men's alliance coming together is super solid. I am not entirely sure whether this will truly stick when it comes time for tribal. And even outside of that, Owen did not get the bulk of the credit for this move. I mean, it does seem like it was something that Sammy was initiating more so than anything else. So I feel like even then you could take it or leave it. But at the end of the day, I did feel like this was a mostly middling episode for Owen. And while I wouldn't say he's dead in the edit per se, I feel like there isn't too much to prop him up at this point. So because of that, he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we're actually sticking with the Baka tribe here. But here we have Ellie. And I feel like this episode only reinforced my belief that Ellie is essentially just the Shan of the season, someone who is established as a big player, gets a ton of personal content in the pre-merge, but it ultimately is eventually turned on and has a spectacular downfall. And I feel like this episode only doubled down on this notion where she gets a ridiculous amount of personal content with her propping up her moment of her solving the puzzle, leading that into her talking about having ADHD and how people underestimated her and her calling her stupid and how she couldn't believe that she was the one to do it and solve the puzzle, which I did find pretty nice. I mean, it was a somewhat relatable moment for me, but also it's just this personal content overload that I feel like is probably more of a red flag than it seems like on the surface. But then more negatively, we do see her talking strategy and she calls Sammy her older child and Owen her younger child. And then talking about how the men haven't been playing the game, only to cut to the men back at camp where Sammy talks about forming a guys alliance and working together, which isn't great for Ellie as she does seem a bit overconfident there, to where I wouldn't be surprised if she gets blindsided at this next tribal, and possibly loses Janine here, which obviously isn't great there. So I still feel like Ellie is someone who is probably going to have a deep run, someone who is probably going to be a major force in the season. However, I feel like there's a bit more negativity now that I can associate with her that leads me to think she's probably not going to win the game, both from a personal content overload perspective, but also from her being a bit overconfident in the game. So because of that, she has fallen here to number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we're jumping back to the Vessi tribe, and we have another pretty interesting case to talk about here, but here we have Cody. And do I feel that great about Cody? Not exactly. I mean, I still feel like he's going to be a pretty big character for the most part, someone who is definitely going to be a big factor in the season, but may not actually win at the end. Mind you, I feel like this was a better episode for Cody than it was for Ellie, where he does talk about being a fun presence, and he does get his intro package about how his friend died and how that caused him to take life to the fullest and not take a lot of risks. And I feel like that is something that can translate to a season-line storyline of him wanting to play the game as hard as he can, which resembles his life. Now, if this were in the premiere, I feel like I would have had Cody quite a bit higher for talking about this. So the fact that it is coming in episode 2, again, not as substantial of an episode, I do like that is a bit of a knock there, but we do see him over the course of the episode do that. I mean, he does pick at the beware advantage, without thinking about it too much. He picks it up and is saddled with this challenge of collecting beads, which he is able to do. He is propped up to a degree where he's able to get the beads, and at Tribal, they show that flashback of him getting the last bead for Noel. But at the same time, we also hear Jesse talking about how this was dumb of him and how he should have saw Survivor 41 and how you never pick up something called the Beware Advantage, especially when they're about to go to Tribal. And I do worry a bit about that it was presented a bit negatively there. But again, I do feel like Cody picking up the Beware Advantage is consistent with the storyline that was set up for him here, with him wanting to take all these risks and stuff. And ultimately, he does get his way here by getting Neca and Jesse to stick together and voting out Justine here. Now, granted, he does get a vote here where it is explained very briefly, mind you, that Justine and Noel want to split the vote between him and Neca in the case that Neca chose to play the shot in the dark. And that was a pretty quick moment, and it did translate to him getting that vote at the Tribal, which honestly kind of killed all of the suspense here, where it was being set up as his pretty close vote here, with it all coming down to whether Cody got the vote. And with the Cody vote coming out, it did kind of sap all the suspense out there by making it at worst a 2-1 vote where Justine goes out anyway. But it's still presented as a big moment with Cody getting the final bead and getting his vote there to vote out Justine. So at least there's that. So at the end of the day, I do walk away from this episode a bit higher on Cody than I was before. And yes, while I don't feel like his chances are great, I still feel like he's going to be a big character per se. I do feel a bit more confident in him than I was before. And I feel like there is at least now a storyline that could translate to him being a big player in the season. So because of that, I do have him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I had a debate over where to put this person, as I did consider putting this person higher, and in fact I had them at number 3 at one point, but after thinking about some more, I did bump them down a little bit. But here we have Sammy. And the main reservation I have with Sammy at this point is I don't know how solid this men's alliance is going to be, where at least on the show it is presented as them undercutting Ellie here by her saying, oh, the men aren't playing, only to show them talking about potential strategy moving forward. But with that said, it did feel like Gabler and Owen were a bit lukewarm to the idea of the men working together and them trying to take out either an Ellie or Janine here, which does worry me about Sam to a degree, as he is the one shown creating this alliance and him trying to get these two to work together. So I do feel like I had to hold myself a bit back from putting him higher because of that. But with that said, I do feel like Sammy has a good shot here. I mean, he does get to continue the storyline about being underestimated, about how he is so young and how people have always underestimated him throughout his life. And obviously that translates to him here being underestimated by Ellie, and that her thinking like they don't talk game when in fact they actually are talking game. And if this men's alliance does come together, and if they do manage to pull off a big vote here and taking out Janine, I feel like that would really prop up Sammy to a degree. And considering how much content Janine is getting right now, and all the red flags I talked about earlier, I do feel like that is a somewhat realistic possibility of these three men coming together to blindside Janine at the next tribal. So at least there's that. And I do feel like Sammy is going to be a big character moving forward. And also, I did find his Patrick Mahomes joke to be pretty funny, all things considered. So I do feel like Sammy is someone who can be a strong contender here. But I feel like the main test for him coming into these next couple episodes will be whether this men's alliance that he is credited with creating holds strong and actually translates to something within the game. And I feel like until we see that, I feel like I can't have him too much higher than here. But still, I'm still pretty impressed by his edit so far, and still impressed by his potential longevity here. So because of that, he is here number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and these two are a little weird as they were literally my top 2 in my first power ranking, and yet they didn't get any content here at all, which should be a knock, and I do knock them to a degree for them not getting any content. But with that said, I feel like their premieres are strong enough to where I can't fault them too much. By number 4, we do have Lindsay, who again is staying in the same relative placement here, only bumped down 2 spots. And again, I still feel confident about Lindsay. I feel like her premiere was good enough on her own to warrant a season-long story arc, and I do feel like she is someone who's going to be a big player here. But again, Coco didn't get any content, and really the fact that they didn't dedicate any time to her, even though Coco wasn't that important to the story, while instead focusing on Ryan and Gio, is probably a bigger knock than I'm giving credit for. But I feel like in the absence of negativity outside of that, and considering that it is probably better to not get any content in episode 2 than it is to say not get any content in episode 1, I feel like that is enough to have her at least this high on the list, though I could see her dropping in future rankings. But for now, she is here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we have a very similar person to talk about, but here we have James. And again, a lot of the stuff still applies to James here. I still feel like he had a good enough premiere. I feel like he does seem to have the upper hand over Lindsay in terms of his strategic content, and I do feel like he will still be a big player on Coco moving forward. But again, it's his lack of content here that does bump him down to a degree here, and similar to Lindsay, I could see that fluctuating depending on whether Coco continues to get content moving forward. But for now, I did decide to leave him here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel a little weird putting these two this high, as on one hand, they were relatively high on my last power ranking, and I feel like they will still be pretty strong contenders moving forward, but I also feel like they have plenty of downfalls that could lead to them being taken out towards the end game. But at number 2, I did decide to go with Carla here. And I feel like the biggest advantage with Carla is that she does at least get a check-in, or at least gets to talk a bit about how the tribe is unified, but is worried about Ryan and Gio being so close to each other, which then leads directly into Ryan and Gio being very close to each other. Now, obviously, considering how little content Coco got, the fact that Carla was someone to get a check-in, despite her not even being the focus of the scene, does seem to be a pretty big positive for me. And again, it's a sign that she'll be a pretty big player moving forward. And considering that it leads into Gio getting his intro package and his introduction here, I do feel like this could be a way of further solidifying Gio as a potential partner for her moving forward, to where she decides to possibly vote out Ryan in order to get closer to Gio. I feel like that is a possibility, though it also sets up the fact that Carla is, at the very least, a swing vote coming into this tribal if Coco does go to tribal relatively soon. So I feel like there's that. And also I feel like she is someone who, again, gets a minor check-in, but nothing too overbearing to where you don't feel like she is going to be this big character per se, which I do feel like is pretty positive. And coming off the back of a pretty strong premiere, I feel like that'll be very solid for Carla moving forward. But with that said, I do feel like there's still some question marks with Carla moving forward, particularly whether she'll actually choose to keep Geo. That does make me question a bit where her edit is going. But considering the fact that she is one of the few Coco members to get a check-in, followed up by a pretty strong premiere, I did decide to have her this high, and at least above James and Lindsay, who I also feel like are strong contenders from her tribe. But I feel like the number one person is a bit more conventional for me, so because of that, she is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 43 right now is Jesse. Now, honestly, I wasn't super confident with putting Jesse at number 1, as I do feel like there are still some potential pitfalls for him moving forward. Again, I feel like similar to Ellie, I feel like he is someone who could end up just being a big player, someone who is a pretty big factor in the season, but is someone who is ultimately taken out later on in the game. And I still feel like that concern holds here. Mind you, I feel like his presence here is a bit more justified in that they had to go to tribal here, and we do see his strategic maneuvering here with him being in the middle. You see him narrating a lot of the action, and we do get a pretty good sense of where Jesse stands in things. But more importantly, Jesse is the one who gets his way here, where he obviously wants Justine out. Justine is the one who goes here. And I feel like moving forward, Jesse will remain to be in a pretty good position as well, to where I feel like he will be this top contender for me. Now again, there are still those concerns about him being too visible in the edit, and I feel like through that he could be taken out. But I feel like, again, he doesn't get as much personal content overload as someone like an Ellie, but also his content here is more justified in that they were going to tribal and that he needed to articulate his game to a degree. And I do like the way he articulates his game as well. So I feel like he is still going to be a pretty strong contender. And while I do see him potentially dropping in future rankings, particularly if Coco starts to get more content, then I do feel like Jesse would probably drop to a degree. But for now, considering the state of this episode, considering the fact that a lot of my very top contenders didn't get that much content here, and with my reservations about certain other contenders like a Sammy, I do feel like Jesse checks off the most boxes for me at this point, and because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so stay tuned for that. The Amazing Race 34 power rankings are also underway as that season is playing out, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.